I'm grateful to be here today. I'm glad to have, I have three chaperones. I'm married to one of them. The other two are my daughters. And so Katie was the assigned chaperone for this trip. And so we're just spending the weekend with some folks who've been a blessing to us. And I said, Katie, will you go on this trip with me? I said, all you have to do is eat all weekend. So she thought she could work that out. And so she and her mother called it the culinary tour. So we did Mexican Friday night. Yesterday afternoon was Italian. Last night, with the Laney gang, we ate at the Greek. And so we don't know what Gary has planned for lunch today. But we have enjoyed our tour, and we didn't know that we would also be doing some feeding. We've had a little bit of an adventure this weekend. In many ways, when we parked at the hotel on Friday night, I heard the sound of a kitten. And I said, Katie, that's a kitten. So my first thought was, oh yeah, like there's a kitten roaming around this hotel. And then I'm like, no, Katie, this kitten is under our car. So I get out of the car and the meowing gets louder and I walk around to the passenger side, to the seat behind where Katie is sitting, and I get down, I lie on the ground and I look, and there is a kitten hanging halfway out of the splash guard that's on the bottom of my school car. And so Katie and I became parents for the weekend. And so we made a quick Walmart run. They do make replacement milk, and I got a syringe, and yes, just like when she was little. In fact, it's been a great educational thing. Used to do this all the time. Every 3 to 4 hours, we're feeding this kitten. Yesterday, we went to lunch. We came back. I parked the car, and guess what? I heard another kitten meowing. So this time, it was so far up in this splash guard that we had to make a trip to Advanced Auto Parts. And so I did some work on the car. So if you want 2 kittens, I can arrange that for you. One of the feral barn cats apparently decided that was a great place to stash them. Christina Stanton was looking out her 24th floor balcony after the first plane had hit the first tower and the black smoke was billowing up. She was working later that day, and so she said she was still in her nightgown and didn't even have shoes on. And she stood on her back balcony as the smoke billowed up. When the second jet came by, it came within 500 feet of her 24th floor apartment. The sound and the force of the jet that close was so powerful that it literally knocked her down and it knocked her out. And when she woke up, for a little while, she could not hear. Quickly, she and her husband grabbed what they could. They grabbed his wallet, the dog, and the dog leash, and they got out of that apartment. They joined thousands of other New Yorkers as they ran down the street, she said, as that yellow smoke billowed down from above them. They ran as hard as they could, as fast as they could, until literally they couldn't go another step. And so they stopped, gasping for breath, and she asked her husband, "Are we going to live?" Her husband, Brian, who was a financial executive, she was a tour guide leader. All he could think of was the Lord's Prayer. So there on the sidewalk, covered in yellow dust, he started going through the Lord's Prayer. It took her 15 years to be able to really talk about it much, and she finally wrote a book about their experiences. And the book is especially about how it changed her life perspective. When the attacks happened, I learned, wow, I actually have no control. My worldview has totally changed. What I'd like us this morning is I'd like to talk about supplications in the shadow of a sword. I want us to wrestle with what do we do in those moments in life when everything we thought we knew is turned upside down. We're just a few weeks removed from September 11th. And even just prior to that anniversary and since then, many horrible things have happened and have continued to happen in our country. And we've got this sense that everyone seems to be at everyone's throats, and that's not a new thing, but just sometimes there are horrible events that bring the worst side of humanity to light. And sometimes when awful things happen, it may not be world events, maybe in your family it's a diagnosis. I think about an email I got yesterday morning from one of our vice presidents who lost his mother that morning. Maybe it's some financial crisis in your family, but we all have, if you will, our September 11th moments. When things happen in our lives that are gut-wrenching and horrible and heartbreaking, or things happen in our country and our world, and they cause us to rethink things. They challenge our faith. And as we're going to see with the Christians in Acts chapter 12, it can challenge our prayer lives. The biblical bullseye I'd like to focus on this morning is mud to a masterpiece. I want to dive into a powerful story in Acts chapter 12. It's important to recognize that when this happens, a number of great things have been happening leading up to it. You've got in chapter 8 the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch. In chapter 9, you've got the conversion of Saul, who is leading the opposition against Christianity. You've got the conversion of an uncircumcised Gentile who is a Roman commander in Acts chapter 10. You've got the establishment of the good news of Jesus and a congregation and new Christians in the city of Antioch in Syria. And that's a big deal because Antioch is the third largest city in the Roman Empire with 500,000 people. The good news going there is going to play a key role to the good news going across the planet. You've got in chapter 11, you've got the church in Jerusalem accepting the fact that the good news is now going to uncircumcised Gentiles because they didn't mind the whole world believing in Jesus. They just couldn't imagine a world where you believed in Jesus and you were saved and you weren't also circumcised. So growth is happening. Maturity is happening. The gospel is spreading. The church is growing in Jerusalem and elsewhere in spite of persecution. But then the unthinkable happens. If we look in chapter 12, we're going to find a gut-wrenching moment that is going to challenge those early Christians. It's going to be, if you will, their September 11th. I need us to understand a couple of things that were patterns in the early part of the book of Acts. One is these people prayed. It was a part of their DNA. You can look in chapter 1, verse 14. You can look in chapter 2, verse 42. After 3,000 are baptized into Christ, they continued in the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. Prayer was a part of who they were, and for many of them, they were leaving where they had come from to stay in Jerusalem. After they were converted to Christ in Acts chapter 2, many of these people would have been from other parts of the Roman Empire. And it looks like they stayed in Jerusalem because the only Christians in the whole world are there. There's no manual to take home on how to live a life in Jesus Christ. The manuals were the 12 apostles. They were the ones who helped them to know how were they able to live in Jesus as the Messiah they'd been looking for. So what do you do when everything changes? I mean, many of these folks lost jobs and families. They're being transplanted to Jerusalem. Prayer was a part of the DNA of who they were. One thing we also notice is that while apostles were targeted in the persecution on the church, and while apostles were arrested, and we find examples of that in Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5, a consistent habit was they were released. And so you got Peter and John arrested, and they're let go in chapter 4. You've got all the apostles, and they're released by the power of an angel in Acts chapter 5. And you've got this persecution that breaks out against the whole church in Acts chapter 8. And you've got Christians who are fleeing Jerusalem for their lives, but it's almost like there's some kind of halo of protection around the apostles. They didn't leave Jerusalem. And even though they're arrested, none of them are losing their lives like the other Christians. So it's almost like there was a little bit of a hands-off policy in Jerusalem towards the apostles. That all changes. It's all different. after Acts chapter 12. Now, about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. You have references in the New Testament to a number of Herods. We have Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa the First, and Herod Agrippa the Second are some of the Herods that are mentioned in our New Testament. Herod Agrippa the Second, the son of the one that we're dealing with here, was responsible, or at least participated in one of Paul's hearings that we read about in Acts chapter 26. But Herod the Great was the one responsible for the death of the children in and around Bethlehem when Jesus was born. That's the grandfather of Herod Agrippa the First in this story. Herod Agrippa the First's uncle, Antipas, was the one responsible for the beheading of John the Immerser. He came from a brutal, brutal family. He came into power in spite of some things happened in his early life. His grandfather actually killed his father when he was 3 years old. He was removed from the area to Rome, likely for his safety. And in Rome, he was raised with royalty. He grew up with a future emperor. He befriended a future emperor. He also grew up with the son of a future emperor. And it was all of those relationships that would play a role in him becoming a king in the area of Judea who ruled under the Roman Empire and answered directly to Caesar. The text says that he arrested some followers of Jesus, but specifically, he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. This is the first time the bubble has burst. This is the first time that an apostle loses his life. And it changes everything. It would have been shocking. It would have been horrible. It would have been terrifying. The Christians likely prayed for him, but the answer was a no. It would have tested everything they thought they knew and believed in. This is not just the death of an apostle. Remember, this is one of the inner three. Peter, James, and John had a special closeness to Jesus. They were at places others were not. They saw things that others did not see. In Mark 9, they're present, the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus is revealed in his eternal brightness and glory. He saw amazing things, had a very close relationship with Jesus. So this isn't just anybody dying. This is a person that would have been known and respected and looked up to among the most influential of the apostles. Our English Bibles, the New American Standard here, describes his death in 14 words. The original language that Luke wrote in and wrote it down, it is recorded in 7 words in his language. I mean, you think about if we were describing such a monumental death, we would probably have a 2-volume work. In their language, he got 7 words. It's a reminder that the Bible is not about the people. The heroes in the stories in our Bibles are not the people. The hero is God, who is working through and often in spite of the people in the story. So James is killed with a sword. Early on in the Roman Empire, beheadings were done with an axe, but eventually they started using a long sword. It was considered the more humane form of capital punishment, though there were some that the form of capital punishment would have been a crucifixion, but they wanted a mode of death for Roman citizens or others who they felt had enough status that they didn't think they were worthy of the brutality and the humbling process of death by crucifixion. So the alternative, the more humane execution, was death by sword. It's not as normal for us in our culture. 28% of the countries that are a part of the United Nations practice capital punishment, and there's 5 common modes, and one of those is beheading, most often practiced in Saudi Arabia. It's a little unusual in our culture, but in their culture, crucifixions and beheadings by the Roman Empire would have been the norm. But this time, it's personal. The text says, when he realized that the Jews, in this case, remember, there were a lot of Jews who were faithful followers of Jesus. And so often when it has this phrase, the Jews did something, it's usually talking about the Jewish leadership, those in power. And when he realized that it made the power brokers among the Jews happy, he decided to arrest Peter. If you've already executed one of the three most influential, why don't you just go get the guy who's listed first in every list of the apostles? So he goes after Peter and he puts him under guard. There would have been 16 soldiers, working in four-person shifts throughout the day, and they would have been guarding him. Josephus, who is the primary historian who helps us to understand the first century world, he tells us some about Herod Agrippa I. Even though he and his family were brutal, Herod Agrippa was actually a friend of the Pharisees. He was popular among the pious Jews because even though he didn't always practice justice, he actually valued living in Jerusalem. You know, a lot of these early leaders, they actually lived in Caesarea, but he chose to live in Jerusalem among the Jews most of the time. He also was fairly strict in observing the rituals of the Old Testament, and that was fairly uncommon. So unjust, brutal, but then he would go through the rituals of the Old Testament, and so he was fairly popular among groups like the Pharisees, and he coveted their support, because a lot of the Roman leaders didn't have a good relationship with Jewish leadership. And so when he realized that his execution of James was popular among the religious power brokers among the Jews, he decided to continue down that path, and he arrests Peter. He seizes him during the days of the unleavened bread, or you've got the feast of the Passover, which commemorated their deliverance from Egypt, and then you had a 7-day unleavened bread feast that followed it. And so Jesus was arrested at the time of Passover, and he was executed by Pilate at the time of the Passover. But Herod Agrippa I, when he arrested Peter during the same feast at a later date, he chose not to execute him during the feast. Why? Well, Pilate didn't really care a lot about Jewish religious festivals. Herod Agrippa I did care about Jewish religious festivals, and so he decided to wait until it was over to bring Peter forward to have his trial and his execution. It's important to recognize that while all of this is going on, the local Christians are praying for Peter. So they're praying in the aftermath of James, and they're praying about the imprisonment. You know, Peter's basically being put on death row. And so the church is praying about it. I think about the story of Esther and how there was a law passed. The Persian king was tricked into passing a law to literally declare a day when it was legal to kill Jews. Well, Mordecai, the Jew, went to Esther, his ward, who he took care of and raised when her father passed away. His ward, Esther, had become queen of Persia. She was Jewish as well, and so he asked her to intervene for her people. She knew that when she went in to meet with the king, he hadn't invited her, and even though she's the queen, she couldn't just show up uninvited into his throne room. And that if he didn't raise his scepter, she would be executed just like anybody else that barged into the throne room. So before she went in, she asked the people to fast, and usually fasting accompanied prayer. So they fasted and they prayed, and then she went in to see the king. The scepter was raised, and the people were delivered. In contrast to that story, we have James, where he was not delivered. He was not set free. If you will, the scepter was not raised. Instead, the sword fell. It's a reminder when it comes to our prayer lives as God's people. Sometimes in response to our prayers, the scepter is raised and we are delivered from the physical distress we're facing. But the reality is also that sometimes the sword falls. And real faith is found when I'll trust in God, I'll trust and pray, whether the scepter is raised or the sword falls. It's easy to say I believe in God and I believe in prayer when my answers are yeses. But I find whether my faith is true faith or false faith in how I respond when I get a no or a not now. And so that very night before he's to be brought forward for trial and execution, he's got a soldier chained to each arm, and he's got 2 soldiers out in the hallway. Remember, he's got squads of 4, and they would have been in addition to all the other guards that normally worked at the prison. He's got 4 just assigned to him. They want to make sure he doesn't get out. Remember, we've got chapter 4 and specifically chapter 5, we've got apostles who've been arrested before and were released by angels. And so Herod Agrippa wants to make sure he doesn't go free. Also, these guards are under penalty. The way it worked in the Roman Empire is if you're guarding someone and they escape, you get whatever their punishment was. So if you're guarding a guy on death row, you're pretty highly motivated to not let that man go free. Now, what I find interesting is the text tells us that the night before he's going to have his head chopped off, he is asleep. Now, let me just ask you, if they're going to remove your head tomorrow morning, do you think you sleep pretty soundly tonight? Do you think you sleep at all tonight? Okay, Katie and I had to lock 2 kittens in the bathroom just to sleep. I don't know what we would do if we thought we were going to die the next morning. I find it interesting that the night before his death, he is sound asleep. There's an important story in Luke that I believe gives us some backstory to the story in the book of Acts. In Luke chapter 8, Jesus and the apostles are in a fishing boat, in a fishing sailboat on the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee was about 14 miles north to south and about 7.5 miles east to west. And it was down in a bowl. On the eastern side, which would be over in this area, you had 1,000-foot cliffs. And then all around here, you had hills that ran all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea. So it was really down in a bowl. And you would have warm winds that would come off the Mediterranean, and they would blow through these mountain passes, and the air would cool down, and your storms come when hot and cold air mix together. And so they would pop out in these passes on the Sea of Galilee, and that's how their storms happen. And so if you're in a fishing boat, a sailboat out in the middle of that, you can have storms on top of you very quickly. You might think about when anybody that remembers back when they used to have a mixing bowl and a mixer when your mama made cakes. Does anybody remember those anymore? All right, so when a storm popped out of those hills and started spinning in the middle of that lake, you know, it's a lot like being in the middle of mama's mixing bowl when she's trying to mix up that batter. That's what it's like if you're in a boat in the middle of that. So it would have been absolutely terrifying. And remember, these guys who are scared to death and think they're going to die, they're fishermen. They lived on the water. This is not their first rodeo. This is not their first storm. Okay, my general rule of life is if I'm in a boat and the professional sailors are scared, I'm scared. And so they're scared. They're afraid they're about to die, but Jesus is asleep the whole time. I cannot begin to imagine what life was like for Jesus and just how exhausted and overwhelmed he must have felt. But he woke up and says, "Where is your faith?" In other words, what he's saying is, guys, God's in the boat with you. God is in the boat with you. And so he gets up, he rebukes the storm, literally tells the storm to be quiet, and it is quiet. They forgot who was in the boat with them. So we fast forward to Acts chapter 12. Now remember, back in Luke chapter 8, Peter would have been one of the apostles who was afraid he was going to die. He would have been one of the ones who said to Jesus, Lord, we're dying out here. Now we fast forward to his own story and his own storm. The night before he's going to be executed, and what is he doing? He is asleep. A subplot, a sub-theme, a sub-story of the book of Acts is the comeback story of Peter. The Peter you meet in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's not the same guy that you see in the book of Acts. He's growing, he's maturing. I think about not long ago, I did a gospel meeting in Batesville, Mississippi. And I went over and visited Lot's cubed ice plant. And it was really fascinating just watching that whole process of how those bags of ice end up in your local convenience store. Well, I've always enjoyed over the years, my dad was a plant manager once upon a time, I've always enjoyed visiting plants and just seeing the process, the mechanization process from beginning to end. The reason I mention that is when you're looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, and you're looking at Peter, you're seeing a person on a spiritual conveyor belt. And the one you meet early in the story of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, is not the same guy you see in Acts because he's further along the assembly line. God is working on him and making him into what he's going to be when he uses him for his glory. I want you to realize that all of us are somewhere on that conveyor belt. We're not yet where God is taking us, so don't despair if you're not there, and don't look down on somebody who's a little further back on the conveyor belt because God can do great things with them just like he did with Peter. He was so sound asleep that when the angel appeared in the room, there's a bright light, and the angel literally had to strike him to wake him up. He is that asleep that the angel, I just pictured an angel kicking him, say, wake up, wake up, wake up. And so the angel wakes him up, and just like you can think about when you've had to awaken a child early in the morning to take them to get tubes in their ears, and they're a little bit groggy, and you say, okay, now it's time to get up. I need you to put your pants on. I need you to put your shoes on. I need you to grab your jacket. Peter is sound asleep. And so when he wakes up, the angel literally has to say, get your belt, get your shoes, get your coat, and come with me. In fact, as you go through it, he didn't think this was really happening. He thinks this is a vision. So the angel wakes him up. He's so asleep, he's groggy and a little bit out of it, and he literally has to tell him exactly what to do to follow him out while God is performing a miracle. And so they go by the guards in the hall, and they go by the guards at the next gate, and they get to the outer gate that leads to the city, and it's not until then that he finally realizes, hey, I'm awake. This is not a dream. This is not a vision. This is actually happening. We think he was imprisoned in the Fortress Antonia, which would have been this structure here. This is a model of first century Jerusalem. It's 1/50th of the size of the original city. You can get a feel for it by looking at the tours that are there. But here's the temple, and over here is the Fortress Antonia. So you've got a gate here, and a gate on this side. So if he's going out of the gate to the city would have been the gate on this far side that he's going out into the city itself. And then right over here are the homes of the wealthy people. That's where he would have headed after he was released. So he leaves this fortress and he goes to the home of Mary, which would have been up in that richer, wealthier section of the city. Mary had money. Okay, first of all, she's got a house in a world like in the lower city, those are one-room houses. But in the upper city, you've got multi-room homes, and Mary's house was big enough that a number of the members of the church could come to pray. It's a gated house. It's got an outer locked gate, and they've got at least one lady who works for the family. Mary had money, and she was using her money to help the church, and so the church is meeting at her home. Rhoda, who works for the family, goes to the front gate because she hears someone knocking at the gate. When she gets out there, she hears the sound of Peter's voice. Peter was so well known to this family. In fact, if you look in 1 Peter chapter 5,
he's going to refer to Mark as his son, likely meaning that he converted John Mark, the son of Mary, to Jesus. Paul has that same expression for Timothy and Titus because he led them to Jesus. So Peter knows his family really well, so well that Rhoda knew who he was by the sound of his voice in the middle of the night. But she is so excited that Peter is at the gate that she leaves him at the gate. Now, does anybody tell us what's the situation for Peter? This is a prison break. He has escaped from prison. He is a wanted man from death row who is on the run, and he's left banging on the outer gate by a family that he thought they were his friends. You know, are neighbors listening? Does somebody come out and say, hey, what's all that banging noise? Hey, wait a minute, aren't you supposed to be in prison? So, I mean, it's just crazy to think about the literal, what's happening here. So she runs back in the house and tells them Peter's outside, and they thought she was crazy. They thought it was his angel. There were some Jews in the first century that believed that they had guardian angels. There were others that believed that if you were a faithful follower of God and you died, you became an angel. I'm not saying those are taught in the Bible. Those were just common beliefs that folks had in that time. The point is, they didn't believe there was any way that it was literally Peter standing out there. Now, I want to remind us, what are they in this house to do? They are in this house to pray. They are there praying for Peter because he's in death row and he's going to be executed the next morning. But when somebody comes and says, Peter's outside, they thought she is crazy. They thought he must have already been executed and it's his guardian angel that's actually out there. So you're just seeing an image or mirage, but it's not really him. And then when they finally see him, they are absolutely amazed. And I find myself saying, why the doubt? You're praying, but when the answer to your prayer walks to the front door, you are shocked. What happened? Remember, these are people in the book of Acts that prayed all the time. Yet when Peter was set free, they couldn't believe that God was actually doing that. Had they forgotten the successes of the past? Had they forgotten the times when the apostles were arrested and released, sometimes even by angels? Were they only focused on the death of James and so overwhelmed by it? I mean, I think about what happens to us when something traumatic happens in our lives. It's as if all the good things in our lives disappeared. And we get caught up in the despair of that moment, and we forget how blessed we are, and we just become overwhelmed because we don't think about the 12 apostles that were released in chapter 5. We're only thinking about the one that died in chapter 12. And so we forget God's blessings in the middle or in the shadow of the sword. Maybe they thought it was going to work out differently. Maybe they weren't even praying for his release at all. Maybe they had just resigned themselves to, he's going to die, and may he die well. The point is, these people who were on fire, who prayed and believed in prayer and had prayed throughout the book of Acts, something had happened, likely the death of James, to douse some of that confidence, to douse some of that faith. And they are beginning to doubt the power of their prayers. When bad things happen, it changes everything. You fill in the blank for what is your death of James, what is your September 11th. I think about for my wife's family when her sister, who was 47 at the time, her youngest sister, when she passed away of cancer, and then 10 months later, her sister's husband suddenly dropped dead of a heart attack and left 3 kids at home. Now, I'm going to tell you, for our family, that'll mess with your faith. That'll mess with your prayer life. But I still believe in God, and she does too. The challenge is to have faith in God even when we have our September 11th. Christina said, I really had to start over from the beginning. Who am I? Who am I in Christ? I would call myself somebody who went to church on Sundays, but I really had not internalized the Bible, internalized who Jesus said he was and who I am in him. She said we had to reevaluate our whole lives, how we lived them. They actually quit their jobs because they realized that there were more important things in life, from mud to a masterpiece. A couple of 3 years ago, I did a gospel meeting in Fayette, Alabama. If you were to read it on a map, it says Fayette, Alabama. But do not say Fayette when you are there, or they will know you are not from there. Okay, it's Fayette, F-E-T. And so when we did this meeting at Fayette, they had a little museum. And I went down and visited this museum. They had local works of art. There was even a local preacher of the church that had some art there. But this particular art is done by Jimmy Sudduth. There's actually a self-portrait of him up there on the left. Jimmy Sudduth was born in Alabama in 1910. He passed away in Fayette in 2007. His artwork is literally all over the world. It's in famous museums around the world. It's in the Smithsonian. Jimmy Sudduth never had a lot of money growing up, but he loved art and he loved to paint. And so all of his canvases are plywood, basically, because he couldn't afford the fancy canvases. To make his paints, he would take mud and he would mix it with sugar water, and then he would get the color for his paints from vegetables. For example, he liked to use turnip greens and the color from turnip greens. That would be hard for me because I would want to eat the turnip greens, but that's a separate story. But he was able to make all of these colors using different vegetables, etc. He was literally able to take mud and make masterpieces that are seen around the world. In Genesis chapter 2, God took from the mud of the earth and made us. He made human beings. In the aftermath of what happened here with the death of James and the deliverance of Peter, Peter said, "Go tell James, the brother of Jesus," a different James, "and go tell the brethren what God has done." And the word continued to spread, and the church continued to grow. You see, what God did in Acts chapter 12, even Herod Agrippa I was held accountable for his actions. God took mud and made a masterpiece because our God is a master of turning mud into a masterpiece. My request of us is whatever happens in our country or in the world or in our lives that messes with our faith and our prayer, don't give up on prayer or the God we pray to. Do not give up on prayer or the God we pray to. He has never left his throne. He is still sovereign Lord of all is, and he's still at work. And it's often in those darkest moments that God's power and our faith can shine the brightest. Remember, you can only see stars in the dark. As we think about prayer, I want you to think about somebody may have been praying for you. There may be somebody this morning who's never expressed their faith in repentance, confession, and baptism. My suspicion is a bunch of people in this room have prayed that you would give God your life. For those of us who are Christians and we're here this morning, but we realize that what we're living out there isn't consistent with what we claim to be here, that we're not living like we ought to, my guess is somebody has been praying that we will come back to God. Are you calm in your cell? Can you sleep in your ship? Has the sword of suffering sapped your strength and your faith? Then maybe the day is the day that you start a spiritual fire and have a renewed desire and energy and commitment to keep on praying and to keep believing in the God we pray to. If we can help you in any way, won't you come as we praise our God?